what reparation looks like to me for all blacks on the earth, regardless of who held your suffrage papers. This is not just about you. This is about all blacks who came before you and who will come after you. Part 2 of 6. When we speak about reparation, we must make selections that keep on giving. Free land, let's talk about that. We must stipulate that we get free land in the form of a few fully developed states in the United States of America, on islands in every body of water, and every country involved in the slave trade. Why? We weren't allowed to earn an income or own anything. Most importantly, we weren't allowed to own land. Wealth is generational. If left over generations, it compounds and grows. This has contemporary effects. We don't need tolerance. We need our own space. In the United States today, the average Black American household owns just 6 cents of every $1 of wealth held by the typical white household, and blacks make up just 1.7% of the top 1% of wealthy Americans. Who owns the land has the power. History shows that when blacks were allowed ownership of land, we created and innovated communities where we used the skills that, while enslaved, garnished billions in wealth for the dominant group of people. Tulsa, Oklahoma, known as Black Wall Street, is a perfect example of what blacks can do. Besides turning this Tulsa land into a booming community, the blacks also discovered oil on this Tulsa land. So you know all of that is what encouraged them to go in and drop bomb on this community. History has also proved that every time blacks are given the opportunity to break free from the dominant group of people, when we rise above their expectations, they swoop in and destroy what we have built. The dominant group has proven resourceful in finding ways to incorporate themselves in our success, to pillage us in some way. Perfect example, they created a bank for blacks only. However, they stole the money and closed the bank without demanding penalty on the guilty. Worse off, after they found out what happened, they sent a black man to oversee the bank. Like always, this is their way of putting a black face on their atrocity. Legally considered property, slaves were not allowed to own property of their own. They were not allowed to assemble without the presence of a white person. The law establishing the Bureau, enacted by Congress in March of 1865 and signed by President Lincoln, authorized this agency to divide abandoned and confiscated land in the South into 40-acre plots for rental and sale to farmer slaves and loyal white refugees. 2 months earlier, General William T. Sherman had issued Special Field Order 15, setting aside tens of thousands of acres in South Carolina and Georgia for the settlement of freed people. He also authorized the Army to lend the settlers mule. Shortly after emancipation in 1865, Black Americans began fighting for the rights to the land they had long worked, cultivated by their hands, fed by their sweat, and stained by their blood. Under Sherman's order and the Freedmen's Bureau Act thousands of black families were settled on federal government held land. Then President Johnson ordered the land returned to its former owners, and the black families were required to sign labor contracts. Those who resisted were forcibly evicted, sometimes by the same federal soldiers who had emancipated them in the first place. Yet while the government stifled freedmen's demands for 40 acres and a mule as just compensation for generations of unpaid, brutalized slave labor, they simultaneously granted free land to whites. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Become a frequent visitor of Hobby Money. When the failure of land distribution among blacks during the Reconstruction is judged within the context of the Homestead Acts, the reality of the situation is laid bare. The problem was never the radical nature of land reform. The problem was racism. When judged comparatively with other nations' emancipatory histories, the Reconstruction experience in the United States is unique. While Black Americans were the only freed slaves to be granted political rights so soon after emancipation, those rights were limited for people without capital or job prospects. Land would have served as the primary source for reparation. President Abraham Lincoln signed the original Homestead Act into law during the second year of the Civil War. Between 1868 and 1934, it granted 246 million acres of western land, an area close to the landmass of both California and Texas, to individual Americans virtually for free. To receive 160 acres of government land, claimants had to complete a three-part process. First, file an application. Second, improve the land for 5 years. And third, file for the deed of ownership. Now, they telling this to a group of people, and if they were speaking to us at that time, they were not allowing us to learn to read or write. So I don't know how this process could have been filed by anybody looking like us. Most importantly, to this day, if you want government land for agriculture, this is the process they use. If you go and look it up, it may change a little bit, but this is the same process. Because of the date of the Act's passage, few people of the South initially received any benefit from it. Yet given that it effectively remained in place until 1934, well over 1.5 million white families, both American-born and immigrant, eventually profited from it. And although the process was rife with fraud, as many homesteaders sold their plots to corporations, the original claimants pocketed the income from land sales, establishing a basis of wealth and capital. By the end of the Act, more than 270 million acres of Western land had been transferred to individuals, almost all of whom were white. Nearly 10% of all the land in the entire U.S. was given to homesteaders for little more than a filing fee. Enacted in 1866, shortly after the end of the Civil War, the Southern Homestead Act, SHA, was supposed to function much like the original Act. During the first year of the SHA, unoccupied Southern land was offered exclusively to Black Americans and loyal whites, but after 1867, even landless former Confederates applied. Although the SHA ostensibly offered a solution to several pressing Reconstruction era issues. In reality, a large percentage of the land offered was unfarmable, being either heavily wooded or covered with swamps. Furthermore, it was hard to administratively arrange homesteading, as many southern states had only one land office. Depending on where the office was located, it could take several weeks to simply make the trip, meaning the bureaucratic duties cost far more than the filing fees for the actual land. To this day, they do crap to set up in our way to keep us from doing things. So this ain't nothing new. Furthermore, the recently emancipated owned no cash and had no experience in dealing with the government, rendering the process even more difficult. Are you listening to me? Okay. But perhaps the biggest hurdle for freed people involved the year-long labor contracts they had been cajoled or forced into signing shortly after slavery was outlawed. Leaving a job before the end date of a contract frequently resulted in virtual re-enslavement on a chain gang. Indeed, blacks had been locked into these contracts until the very date, January 1st, 1867, that they stopped receiving special homesteading benefits. By the end of the SHA, 10 years later, nearly 28,000 individuals had been awarded land, combined with the claimants of the original Homestead Act. Then, more than 1.6 million white families, both native-born and immigrant, succeeded in becoming landowners during the next several decades. Conversely, only 4,000 of 5,500 Black American claimants ever received final land patents from the SHA. Isn't there a big difference between the numbers of whites and the numbers of blacks? Look again, people. Take your time and look. The Homestead Acts were unquestionably the most extensive, radical, redistributive governmental policy in the United States history. The number of adult descendants of the original Homestead Act recipients, these are white people they're talking about, living in the year 2000, and look at the year 2000, was estimated to be around 46 million people, about a quarter of the United States adult population. If that many white Americans can trace their legacy of wealth and property ownership to a single entitlement program, then the perpetuation of Black poverty must also be linked to national policy. The Homestead Acts excluded Black Americans, not in letter, but in practice, a template that the government would propagate for the next century and a half. And it's not a next century or a half. It is still happening to this day. We are in 2019, and this here that they explained there is still happening to this day. With the advent of emancipation, Blacks became the only race in the United States ever to start out as an entire people with close to zero capital. Having nothing else upon which to build or generate wealth, the majority of freedmen had little real chance of breaking the cycles of poverty created by slavery and perpetrated by federal policy. The stain of slavery is much more widespread and lasting than many Americans have admitted. Yet it is the legacy of the Reconstruction, particularly the failure of land redistribution, that so closely coupled poverty and race in the United States. If you don't have a hobby, find a craft that you like. There are a host of crafts available to you. Find out who needs what you produce with your craft. There's always a need. Sometimes people don't know what they need until you bring it to them. Become an expert in your craft by learning everything about it. The more you know about your craft, the better you can exploit it.